I'm still getting over the idea that I could have retired after. I hope my wife doesn't hear that. Anyway, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank all you guys for setting this up. It's always wonderful to follow Eric Westman, who was, helped me see the light 20 odd years ago. Okay, so let me give you the context, because I didn't get into this. I'm not a physician, obviously. I'm not a PhD. I was an investigative science journalist. I was interested in controversial science. I stumbled into the nutrition field in the late 1990s when I realized that there was a controversy over whether or not sodium causes high blood pressure, and then I stumbled into the low-fat diet world, and one thing led to another. But the way you can think of what I do is this, okay? So Margaret Chan, Director General of the World Health Organization, 2016, she's giving a talk, keynote address to the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, the annual meeting, and she describes what she calls the slow motion disaster, which is this epidemic of obesity and diabetes worldwide. Every country in the world is experiencing it, and the data, she says in 1974, 105 million adults worldwide were obese, and then 30 years later, the number had grown sixfold to 640 million. And this went along with the increases in diabetes as well. And the fascinating thing about her talk is she estimated a probability of what she said keeping a bad situation from getting much worse. So that's not curbing the epidemic, it's not reversing the epidemic, it's not like COVID where you're hoping the epidemic will come to an end. What you want to do is just estimate the odds that health organizations like the World Health Organization are going to be able to keep this from getting much worse. And her estimate was, virtually zero. So you've got the head of the World Health Organization predicting with almost complete certainty that this epidemic is out of control and that they won't be able to curb it. And on a situation like that, what you want to do, you would think, is have a team of experts put together, the smartest people around in all the different fields, to examine the underlying assumptions that they've made about this disease, these diseases, and to think maybe that it's not just that their approach might not be correct, but maybe they've made some errors along the way in how they think about the diseases. So if this was AIDS, for instance, and in the 1984-85, you discovered that the HIV virus is the cause of AIDS, and then 45 years later, you've still got rampant HIV, and people are dying right and left from AIDS, and 40% of the country or the world is suffering from it. You might think, well, maybe the HIV virus wasn't the cause. Or if this was lung cancer, and you identify cigarettes as the cause of lung cancer in the early 1960s, and 50 years later, mortality from lung cancer was 6 times what it was in the 1960s, you might think, well, maybe it wasn't the cigarettes. But they don't do that here, okay? And they don't do that in obesity and diabetes because they think they know what the answer is, and they think it's so obvious that nobody could question it. So they don't have to really, and then because they know what the answer is and what they're doing isn't working, they blame the food industry and they blame us for not following their advice. I'm going to skip that slide. So what's the answer? What's the cause of obesity? The etiology is a scientific term. Here's the conventional wisdom. This is from the World Health Organization website. The fundamental cause of obesity and overweight is an energy imbalance between calories consumed and calories expended. Okay, this is the sort of $5 scientific version of that same statement. From a thermodynamic perspective, it's clear that obesity is generally the consequence of small cumulative imbalances of energy intake and expenditure. The technical term is it's an energy balance disorder. Okay, so when you read the literature, this phrase will show up all the time. The idea is you consume more calories than you expend and you get fatter. The non-technical term is we overeat. And the biblical terms would be gluttony and sloth. Okay, so we eat too much, physical inactivity. Here's what the hypothesis looks like. Okay, if you consider this a scientific hypothesis, too much food, too little physical activity leads to overeating, energy in greater than energy out, and the result is obesity and the obesity epidemic, and then we get type 2 diabetes because we're getting fatter and more obese. So that's sort of the explanation. And what somebody like me does is what they should do. You know, and instead journalists like myself and then Nina Teicholz come along and we say, well, you know, we got some time. What the heck, 5 years. This is a hypothesis, okay? It's not dogma, it's not God didn't tell us this was true, it's not chiseled in stone anywhere, it's a hypothesis. You could ask the question, treat this like a science. I've often said to researchers, not politically correctly, I'll say, let's pretend this is a science and ask the question, can we find evidence suggesting this hypothesis is not true, this sort of fundamental prime dogma or prime directive of this field is that obesity is caused by taking in more calories than we consume. And it turns out when you look into it that there's a history to this hypothesis. So modern nutrition science starts in the late 1860s in Germany with the creation of this device, which is a calorimeter. There's a dog up here, and the idea is that put this dog or a human in this box and you can measure the CO2 it expires and the oxygen it takes in, and from that you could figure out how much energy it expends. So for 100 years already at this point we could figure out the energy in foods by burning them in what's called a bomb calorimeter and measuring the heat that's produced. Now you could measure the energy that's expended. And for the next 60, 70 years, all of nutrition science, if you go back and find nutrition textbooks from the 1920s, all of nutrition science is basically protein metabolism, a little bit about fiber, and energy intake and energy expenditure. And by the early 20th century, measuring energy intake and expenditure is a sort of fashionable science in the nutrition world. Just like today it's genomics and proteomics and gut biomics. Back then it was calories. It was the only thing you could measure that seemed relevant to health and disease related to food. So that's what they measured. And by the early 1920s, well, as this is happening, scientists, German biochemist Max Rubner demonstrates that the laws of thermodynamics holds true for living organisms, and then two Americans spend a couple years of their life in the 1890s proving that this holds true for humans as well as animals. They said, well, of course it must, but an experimental demonstration is necessary because that's kind of what science is. And then beginning in the early 20th century, the leading German diabetes specialist, Karl von Norden, publishes a theory that obesity is caused by taking in more energy than he expends. And this idea is floating around, and Louis Newberg, a University of Michigan in the United States doctor, decides he can experimentally demonstrate it. So what he does in 1928-29 is he takes six patients in his hospital, one lean subject and five obese subjects, and he demonstrates that if you semi-starve these people long enough, they all lose weight. Doesn't matter whether they're obese or lean. And somehow this is proof to him that obesity is caused by eating too much. I've read this paper 5,000 times. I cannot follow his logic from one semi-starvation, losing weight, to this means people get fat because they eat too much. But this is what happened. So in 1900s, von Norden declares caloric imbalance as the cause of obesity. He says the ingestion of a quantity of food greater than that required by the body leads to an accumulation of fat and to obesity should the disproportion be continued over a considerable period of time. And then Louis Newberg comes along and he declares that this is a fact of nature and that he has experimentally proven it. And what's interesting is in the 1920s, the whole science of obesity, I mean, you've got these Germans and Austrians measuring energy expenditure, and there's a book that I'm going to quote from later about basal metabolism, which is the metabolic rate and energy expenditure. But the science of obesity is a dozen doctors of various intellectual levels around the world writing articles in the journal saying, this is what I think's happening in my patients. Newberg comes along and he turns it into an experimental science. He says, I've tested the hypothesis, I've done an experiment, all obese people overeat, that's the fundamental rule, and then he says obesity is caused by either a perverted appetite, which is eating too much, or a lessened outflow of energy, which is insufficient expenditure. This is von Norden's thinking that he's now experimentally proven. But there's a problem, okay? If you say obesity is caused by eating too much, which in effect is what he's saying, he said all obesity is caused by eating too much. You ask the question, why don't obese people who suffer from obesity, why don't they compensate? Okay, they could eat less or exercise more, right? And we're going to go through the numbers, but all of this is under conscious control. Eating too much is a behavior, so you should be able to rein it in. And then the answer is, why don't they? People who look like Louis Newberg believe that they do it successfully. It's this picture of Louis Newberg that made me start thinking in terms of we and them. Okay, because people who are effortlessly lean think, I'm lean, I eat in moderation, maybe I exercise. That's probably why I'm lean. And if everyone ate in moderation and exercised, they'd be lean too. And if they don't eat in moderation, or if they're not lean, that suggests to me that they don't eat in moderation, they don't exercise. So what you do is you take an obesity, which is a physiological accumulation of fat in the gut, and you turn it into a mental disorder. So as Newberg says, if the answer to ask the question, why don't obese people compensate, Newberg says because they suffer from various human weaknesses such as overindulgence and ignorance. So as soon as you decide that obesity is caused by eating too much, fat shaming is the next step. To me, it's a direct implication of the hypothesis. You can't escape it, and we'll see how inescapable it is. So you have this problem with too much body fat. You've got this idea, it's energy in, energy out, and you put the problem in the brain. Okay? Nowhere else. Ignorance, self-indulgence, gluttony, and sloth. And it seems simple. And when you read the medical textbooks, Osler that Eric Westman quoted, it seems like there are people who suffer from obesity, like Falstaff is a classic example, and they have these tremendous appetites. They eat an enormous amount, so you assume that the obesity is caused by eating too much. And then you can starve people, like Newberg starved people, and if you starve people, they get emaciated, so that confirms your belief that it's all about the quantity of food they construct. And if you don't think of it any more than that, it seems obvious. But what you could do, which they didn't, is estimate the size of the effect. What are you talking about? When we say obesity is caused by eating too much, what are we talking about? How much? You know, one of the fundamental things you want to do, I like to think of all my books are books about good and bad science and how to think, how good scientists think and how bad scientists think. So one of the things you want to do in the world is quantify the size of the effect you're trying to explain. Like if you believe in climate change, which some of my colleagues don't, how much is the climate changing? You know, how fast is the atmosphere heating up? How big is that effect, and can it be explained by the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? And how big is that effect? So when you ask the size of the effect, this is what the Centers for Disease Control in the US say. They say weight management is all about balance, balancing the number of calories you consume with the number of calories your body uses or burns off. So you want to ask the question, like I'm lean, 25 years old, I just graduated from college, I want to stay lean. So I want to make sure that I don't gain, let's say 20 pounds a decade, because if I gain 20 pounds in a decade, 2 pounds a year, by the time I'm in my 40s, I'll have gained 40 pounds, I'll no longer be lean, I'll be suffering from obesity. So how carefully do I have to balance intake and expenditure to make sure that I don't gain 20 pounds in a decade? Okay? So that's 2 pounds a year. And a pound of fat, as Eric mentioned, is roughly equivalent to 3,500 calories. So we can run through this thing, multiply 2 pounds times 3,500 calories, and then divide it by the number of days in the year. It's an 8th grade, 6th grade mathematics in the United States. So like 11-year-olds should be able to do this. And the answer is 19 calories a day. So if I store 19 calories a day as fat that I don't burn for fuel, over the course of a year, I'm going to have accumulated 2 pounds. Over the course of 10 years, I'm going to accumulate 20 pounds. Over the course of 20 years, I'm going to have accumulated 40 pounds. So I have to balance my intake to expenditure to better than 20 calories a day. That's the equivalent of 2 peanuts or 4 olives. Okay, another way to think about it is, let's say when you were your last year in college, you were lean and your best friend was lean. 20 years later, you have gained 40 pounds and your best friend is still lean. you accumulated 4 olives worth of fat every day that he or she didn't. That's the difference. That's the overeating. That's the excess calorie consumption. Okay? 2 gummy bears. It's 0.007 positive energy balance, okay? So, and the obesity epidemic in America is fascinating. That represents an average per capita weight gain of 30 pounds since 1960. That's an average weight gain of a half a pound per year. That's 0.002 positive energy balance. 5 calories per day has been stored as fat. It's half a gummy bear. Okay, so right there you know you have a problem, and I saw this calculation first done in this textbook, Basal Metabolism and Health and Disease. Like I said, all you could do was sort of measure metabolic rate back then, so that's what they did. Eugene Dubois was a leading authority in metabolism in the United States in 1924. This was a seminal textbook. It went through 4 editions. He did this calculation. I don't have it in this slide. And he said that considering this number, how tiny it is. So there's no stranger phenomenon in the maintenance of a constant body weight under marked variation in bodily activity and food consumption. The question shouldn't be, why do some people get fat and other people don't? That's why my book is called Why Do We Get Fat? But the question should be, why doesn't everyone get fat? If in order to avoid it, you have to practice perfect energy balance. If you miss by a gummy bear, that's 10 pounds in a decade. If you miss by 2 gummy bears, that's 40 pounds. Nobody can do that. Russell Wilder, who was the leading authority at the Mayo Clinic on obesity and diabetes in the 1930s, said, look, the whole art of cooking and cocktails and wine is all about making us take in more calories than we would normally by making the food and the alcohol and the beverages taste better. Why aren't we all obese? How can we possibly stay lean if you have to practice energy balance? Okay, there are other arguments against this, by the way. Now I'm going to apologize. I'm going to show photos of naked human beings. Prior to World War II, and I'm now going to be channeling the way Germans and Austrians thought about this problem pre-World War II. They were physicians, like I said, clinicians studying obesity, and they were actually studying their patients. So they would be able to ask questions about their patients, not just is your BMI under 30 or your BMI over 30, which is how researchers think of the obesity epidemic today. That's what they want to explain. Why is a BMI over 30 increased? They would say, look, people get fat in particular ways. They get fat at particular times of their life. They get fat in particular places and not others. So one of the issues was genetics. We've always known, well, we've certainly known for at least 100 years that obesity had the largest genetic component, that obesity runs in families. So this is this is a lean pair of identical twins and an obese pair of identical twins. And our energy balance idea might be able to say why these pair is fat and these pair is not is because these guys practice perfect energy balance and these guys didn't. Okay, but if you ask the question, why do their bodies accumulate fat identically, the energy balance thing says nothing about that. It's a failed hypothesis if we just ask the question, why do these people have identical body fat distributions? You know, the identical twins don't just share the same facial features, they share the same body types. Body types run in family. What controls that? Because it's certainly not anything to do with intake and expenditure. Then there's animal husbandry. There are lean breeds of animal and there are obese breeds of animals, fat breeds of animals. You can see this in cattle where there are like lean strains like Jersey cattle and beefy, stocky strains like Aberdeen Angus. I like this quote particularly. Edwin Aswood, who is the leading endocrinologist, hormone specialist in the United States in the early 1960s, basically gave this talk then, and he gave it to the Endocrine Society. He was the president of the Endocrine Society. He gave this talk, and he said, consider the pig. His corpulence and gluttony resulted from man's artificial selection. Selective breeding provided us with his hulk, with his hoggish ways, and no one will convince me that his gourmandizing is provoked by parental over-solicitude. By this he meant there was this idea that kids get fat because their parents are too solicitous and give them too much food, but the pig just grows up fat. It doesn't know any better. Its appetite matches its bulk. Sexual variations, men and women fatten differently. Okay, men fatten above the waist, women tend to fatten below the waist. So again, our energy balance ideas might say, well, okay, they both got fat because they ate too much, but why did the fat go here on the man and there on the woman? And clearly sex hormones are involved, okay? And if this guy, if you wonder, you ask the question, well, if I'm only looking at the fat on his thighs, I can't tell he ate too much. And if I'm only looking at the fat on her back, I can't tell she ate too much because that fat didn't get bigger. Something's controlling that other than intake and expenditure. Puberty, this is not a pre-World War II photo clearly, but it could have been. Boys and girls enter puberty with roughly the same amount of body fat, okay? They go through puberty, the girls gain fat, they get bigger, they get taller, they get heavier, they gain fat, and they gain fat in very specific places. Okay? The boys go through puberty, they get bigger, they get taller, they lose fat and put on muscle. By the time they're done with puberty, the girls have 50% more fat on their bodies than the boys do. For women, puberty is, you could call it a dipogenic phenomena. It makes them accumulate fat so that they look very different from boys by the time they're done. But it's got nothing to do by how much they eat and exercise. Okay? We know that they've taken in more calories than they expended because they got bigger and heavier. But why did the girls gain fat and gain in specific places? Our theory of obesity says nothing about it. So why energy balance? I mentioned this. It's considered the laws of physics. I mean, that's ultimately, like originally it was just considered, you know, Falstaff eats a lot. He probably gets fat because he eats so much. But we have this energy balance equation. And you often see thermodynamics quoted in papers about obesity. But the idea is delta E, the change in the energy of a system, delta means change, equals the energy in minus the energy out. So the way this is the first law of thermodynamics, it's energy conservation. Basically, it's about energy can either be created or destroyed. So if the energy of a system increases, the energy had to enter the system, and more energy had to enter than leave. It's a simple idea. It's the only law of thermodynamics that's like kind of obvious. The way we use it in nutrition and chronic disease, change in fat mass is equal to energy consumed minus expended. Okay, so the problem, what happened, what this theory says, I mean, it's an equation. There's an equal sign here. So this could say, for instance, 4 is equal to 6 minus 2. And you would never say 4 is caused by 6 minus 2 because that's absurd. It just says that 4 and 6 minus 2 are equivalent. They're the same thing. They're the same number. But what we did in nutrition is we added arrow of causality. So suddenly these researchers said, well, wait a minute. If I have I have a set amount of intake, like my subject is eating 3,000 calories and expending 3,000, then he starts to expend only 2,800. He becomes lazy or bedridden, and he doesn't adjust his intake, then his expenditure, his storage is going to go up, so therefore E in minus E out causes changes in delta E. And we've kept that ever since. And I still get people arguing with me, both professors in academia and nutcases on Twitter, saying, it's the laws of thermodynamics. The laws of thermodynamics don't have an equals. They don't have a causality arrow here. They just said that the change in a system, the change in weight in the system is literally equal to the energy in minus the energy out. They're the same thing. In fact, when we talk about somebody overeating, by overeating, we mean E in is greater than E out, but you can't measure overeating. You have no idea what it is. The only way you know someone's overeating is if they're getting fatter. So the problem is that's technically a tautology, not a hypothesis. The logic is circular. You ask the question, why do we get fat? And the answer is because we're overeating. So you say, how do you know we're overeating? And it's, well, you're getting fatter. So therefore, you're overeating. And why are we getting fatter? Because we're overeating. And how do we know we're overeating? Because we're getting fatter. And the logic goes around and round. And it never actually identifies a cause. And what we want to know is, why is fat accumulation growing? Because if fat accumulation is growing, this is another way to think about it. Fundamental cause of obesity and overweight is an energy imbalance between calories consumed. Remember this from the WHO, I started with this. Imagine if instead of lecturing about body weight and health and weight regulation, I was lecturing about personal finance, and you guys had all come because you wanted to get wealthy. And you asked me, like, why is Bill Gates so wealthy? How can I emulate Bill Gates or Elon Musk or Warren Buffett or pick your billionaire? And I said, well, the fundamental cause of wealth is a money imbalance between dollars earned and dollars spent. Okay? Dollars in greater than dollars out. And then I told you, if you guys want to get wealthy, you're going to have to make more money than you spend. And I clearly haven't told you anything you didn't know, because if somebody's getting wealthier, by definition, they're making more money than they spend. That's the tautology. But in obesity, not only did this become the fundamental dogma, but to say anything else was to be a quack. Like right now, just listening, you still cannot make these statements without half the field thinking that this is somehow quackery. So, while Louis Newberg was claiming that obesity is caused by eating too much, that he had proven it experimentally, 3 years later, researchers, German emigres from fleeing Hitler and Nazi Germany, go to New York City. They get jobs at Columbia University in the laboratory of Harold Urey. These are brilliant biochemists. Harold Urey has just discovered the isotope deuterium, which is a heavy isotope of hydrogen, and it's mildly radioactive. And this fellow, Rudolf Schonheimer, and his colleague, David Rittenberg, realized that they can use deuterium to study what's called intermediary metabolism. So when you're saying obesity is caused by taking in more energy than you expend, that's because you can only measure the energy that you consume, and you can only measure the energy that you expend, and you can't measure what happens to it in between, or the macronutrients, proteins, carbs, and fats, because when you eat them, the whole thing is a black box. You've got no tools to see how the body uses that energy, or how it converts it into fat, or converts, protein into amino acids, into glucose. All you can see is intake and expenditure. Everything in between is what researchers back then called intermediary metabolism. And they started with Schonheimer's breakthrough using deuterium. Suddenly you could tag food. Okay, you could create, in effect, hydrocarbons, carbohydrates, with deuterium instead of hydrogen. You could feed it to animals, and you could follow it through the body, and then you could sacrifice the animal and see where it accumulates. So in 1935, Rudolf Schonheimer and Rittenberg described this new technology and how they can use it, and how until now the whole human body has been a black box. And then the following year, the same year, it's a series of 4 articles. They describe how they took animals, they fed them diets that were limited in calories, so it was guaranteed to make them lose weight. And lo and behold, even though they were losing weight, they were still storing the fat they ate. They said the animals were kept on a diet which was insufficient in quantity for them to maintain weight. Much to our surprise, we found that in spite of the fact that the animals had lost weight, a large proportion of the absorbed fat was deposited in the depots, indicating that the fat which was burned was not oxidized directly after absorption, but had been taken from the fat depots. And over the next 5 years, Schonheimer and Rittenberg basically unraveled this whole thing. And you end up with this very sophisticated science of fat accumulation and intermediary metabolism. And what's fascinating to me as a researcher, like I'm now working as a historian going back in time. So based on Schonheimer's, Rittenberg's work, you get a science of fat accumulation, of adiposity. It's intermediary metabolism, but it's answering the question, what happens in the human body when fat is stored? And based on Louis Newberg's work and von Norden, you have a science of obesity. So you have a science of excess fat accumulation, obesity, and a science of fat accumulation, adiposity. And you would kind of think that they're one and the same, right? That the science of fat accumulation, the science of excess fat accumulation should be related. But by 1948, they've completely diverged. This is right after the Second World War. So John Brobeck, who's now the leading authority on obesity in the United States, is writing about what he calls the regulation of the energy exchange. And he thinks of, and he's an obesity researcher. And Brobeck says regulation of fat storage now appears to be a passive process subject only indirectly to control. Presumably the fatty depots increase in size whenever energy intake exceeds total output and decrease when the situation is reversed. Excessive food intake seems to be the most common abnormality. Now, that was the etiology of excess fat accumulation. What about the etiology, the cause of fat accumulation? This is the seminal review article in the field. It was from Ernst Wertheimer, who was another German biochemist who fled Germany and went to Israel and was working in Tel Aviv, and his graduate student, Bruce Shapiro. This is the first major review in the field on the physiology of adipose tissue, okay, the science of fat accumulation rather than excess fat accumulation. And he says the exact opposite. The nature of the fat deposit in adipose tissue is determined by the balance between the fat and the diet, the fat synthesized in the body. That's now thinking of intermediary metabolism, and that broken down in metabolism. The classical theory that fat is deposited in the adipose tissue only when given an excess of the caloric requirement has finally been disproven. So the same year that the leading authority in obesity is telling you that that's how fat is deposited, the leading authority in fat accumulation is telling you it's been disproven, and mobilization and deposition of fat go on continuously without regard to the nutritional state of the animal. So as the science of fat metabolism is advancing and they're making huge progress, it has split off from the science of obesity. And they're now two entirely different things. Okay, this is how Hilda Bruck put it. Hilda Bruck, another German emigre, a pediatrician, Jewish, left Germany in 1933, settles in New York, in the heart of the Depression in New York City, is walking around New York City and is stunned at how fat the children are. Like in the heart of the Depression, the worst years of the economy of the United States in the entire 20th century, the kids walking around New York City are obese. She has roly-poly fat kids. So she starts the first pediatric obesity clinic in the United States at Columbia University, and by the 1940s, she's the world's leading authority on pediatric obesity. And in this book written in 1957, she says, looking at obesity without preconceived ideas, one would assume that the main trend of research should be directed towards an examination of abnormalities of the fat metabolism, since by definition, excessive accumulation of fat is the underlying abnormality. Right? If you've got somebody who's 8 feet tall and you've got an abnormality of growth, you study abnormalities of growth metabolism. Not here. She says it so happens that this is the area in which the least work has been done. She was actually wrong. A lot of work had been done. It just hadn't been applied to obesity. It wasn't considered relevant. So what happens is researchers start developing a science of fat storage, okay? An adiposity hypothesis rather than an obesity hypothesis. And this alternative hypothesis says obesity is a disorder of excess fat accumulation. So the science of fat accumulation is relevant. Not energy balance, not overeating, not sedentary behavior, fat accumulation. And gluttony and sloth are compensatory effects, they're not causes. And one way to think of this is the idea of obesity as a constitutional disorder. The best statement I ever saw about this was actually George Bernard Shaw's, a famous British playwright. He wrote a play called Misalliance in 1910. One of the characters, John Tarleton, says, no matter how little you eat, you put on flesh if you're made that way. That's the constitutional disorder theory of obesity. No matter how much little you eat, you put on flesh if you're made that way. In this theory, it's not about intake and expenditure causing fat accumulation. If anything, the dysregulation in fat storage causes changes in behavior in how much people want to eat and exercise. Okay, so in this theory, John Falstaff from Shakespeare, is it John if it wasn't Falstaff, wasn't fat because he was gluttonous. He was gluttonous because his body wanted to weigh 400 pounds. And he had to fuel that body, and that made him hungrier than somebody whose body only wanted to be 150 pounds or 200 pounds. By this theory, those of us who fatten easily want to eat more than those people who don't because our bodies are trying to get fatter. Okay, it was a German-Austrian hypothesis pre-World War II. The leading authorities, the leading proponents were Gustav von Bergmann, who was a leading authority in internal medicine in Germany in the first half of the 20th century. In the early 100 years later, the leading award for the German Society of Internal Medicine, I think it was the Gustav von Bergmann Medal. He was no quack. And then Julius Bauer, who was the leading geneticist and endocrinologist at the University of Vienna, which was one of the great universities of the world pre-World War II, and may still be. This is how Bauer put it. Okay, he used the phrase, where is it? Lipophilic tissue. Lipophilia means love of fat. And what they needed was a phrase, a characteristic to describe why some tissue accumulates fat and other tissue doesn't. So like below the weight tissue for women is lipophilic, above the waist for men it's lipophilic. If you feel your forehead, you don't get fat on your forehead. So that's not lipophilic, but we all know where we do get fat, love handles and you name it. It's like the things we focus on. There are fatty tumors called lipomas, in which this lipophilia is somehow magnified by a mutation in the cells. So they needed a phrase to describe the regional the tendency of tissue to accumulate fat locally, and that was it, lipophilia. So Bauer said like a malignant tumor, or like the fetus, the uterus or the breasts of a pregnant woman, the abnormal lipophilic tissue seizes on foodstuffs, even in the case of undernutrition. It maintains its stock and may increase it independent of the requirements of the organism. A sort of anarchy exists. The adipose tissue lives for itself and does not fit into the precisely regulated management of the whole organism. A lipomatous subject may die of starvation and still remain lipomatous. There was a Harvard researcher in the 1940s who described different body types. And the way he phrased it is you could starve a basset hound, you don't end up with a greyhound, you end up with an emaciated basset hound or a dead basset hound. It's like body type is inherited. Russell Wilder at the Mayo Clinic, I mentioned this hypothesis got it was beginning to be accepted as the 1930s went on, when Wilder, who was a leading obesity diabetes authority, said, imagine the effect after meals of withdrawing from the circulation even a little more fat than usual might well account both for the delayed sense of satiety and for the frequently abnormal taste for carbohydrate encountered in an obese person. So a little more than usual, 10, 20 calories a day. A slight tendency in this direction would have a profound effect in the course of time. The hypothesis deserves attentive consideration. Hugo Roney, who wrote the first monograph on obesity in the United States in 1940, he was a Hungarian emigre who had come to the States in the 1920s, was working at Northwestern University, said this theory was now more or less fully accepted, chiefly in Germany by a number of leading investigators of metabolic diseases. And then World War II comes along, and the German and Austrian medical community evaporates with the war. In fact, they chase a lot of their scientists to the United States, but in medicine and in public health, we wanted nothing to do with these people. In physics, we embraced them because we had atomic bombs to build and a war to fight. But great universities in the Northeast Corridor in the United States had actually regulations in place so they wouldn't be overrun by European and particularly Jewish European emigres. So these scientists just evaporated. Julius Bauer, who was a leading proponent, actually fled Austria in 1938 when the Nazis invaded, moved to the US, worked for a year at Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I could imagine his culture shock. And then went to Los Angeles, where he got a job with at the Hospital of Medical Evangelists in Los Angeles. And in 1941, he wrote an review article in the Annals of Internal Medicine describing the inanity. He spends 10 pages on all the ways this energy balance theory fails to explain anything. And then 10 pages explaining why obesity has to be a constitutional hormonal disorder. He says the current energy theory of obesity, which considers only an imbalance between intake of food and expenditure, is unsatisfactory. It's a distribution of energy in the body too which counts. What happens after you eat, not alone the rough imbalance between its intake and output. Eric, stay awake. I know you've heard this before, but yeah, it's late. A lot of carbs at dinner, at lunch. The adipose tissue is not merely a passive storing place for reserved fat, but a living and active part of the body with its own physiological and pathological processes. An increased appetite with a subsequent imbalance between intake and output of energy is the consequence of the abnormal Anlage. Anlage was a German term for constitutional disorder rather than the cause of obesity. Newberg, a year later, has to respond. This is like people on Twitter having a Twitter argument or bloggers having a blogger argument, but in the medical community during World War II, it took a year for the response to show up in print. Bauer's article was 20 pages. Newberg's article was 60 pages. Same journal. The suggestion of von Bergman, 60 pages, this was all he said about it. The suggestion of von Bergman, so volubly defended by Bauer, that the fat cells of obese persons possess an abnormally great avidity for fat and an exaggerated capacity for retaining it, finds no support in experiments designed to test its validity. Bodybuilding is inherited, obesity is not. And then he still has to explain why people get fat, because why don't they just eat less? Okay? So now we get to the fat shaming. Same article. While no attempt is made to discuss the ultimate origins of behavior, the understanding of obesity will be advanced by making a list of proximate causes to which some persons respond by overeating. Overemphasis by a parent of the importance of food, that's Aswood's parental over-solicitude. Gratification obtained from the flavors of foods, the feeling of repose and comfort produced by a full stomach. I love this one. The temporary respite from anguish caused by intellectual, social, or sexual failure. The food habits of youth, disabling disease with its lessened energy requirement. If you believe people got fat, if you're arguing that they get fat because they eat too much, you have to explain why they don't do what you do, which is eat in moderation. And so you think of every possible explanation, and you turn a disorder of excess fat accumulation into a psychological disorder. And you could find many of these explanations in modern textbooks today, and if I had endless time, I would quote from them. This is the death of a theory, okay? You can do what's called citation analysis in this day and age. So in 1941, Bauer published his 20 pages article. And by 1959, it's cited by 10 other articles, and then never again until my book comes out. And then the following year, and the year after, Newberg publishes his 60-page article, and then the year following, and they're cited continuously for the next 100 years, okay? Is this anti-German stigma? I don't know. Is it... Newberg seemed to make sense because most physicians are lean and they think that most people get obese because they eat too much. I don't know. But Bauer's theory died with the war. This is the death of this constitutional hormonal obesity theory. And Newberg's theory was cited ever after until it got to the point you didn't have to cite it anymore because we know that obesity is an energy balance disorder. So theories of obesity post-Newberg in World War II are not theories of obesity, they're theories of eating behavior because they're trying to explain why fat people eat too much because that's what they believe has been proven experimentally. So you've got this glucostatic theory of food intake. These are the two where the idea is that the brain is measuring blood sugar swings and it's responding to blood sugar. And in people who are obese, that doesn't work. So they eat too much. And that was Jean Mayer at Harvard. And then George Kennedy at the National Institute for Medical Research had something called a lipostatic theory where they're not responding to the fat tissue. Is secreting something into the bloodstream that's telling the brain when enough fat has been accumulated and inhibiting appetite. And it's this theory that's the direct antecedent of the idea that leptin, the hormone leptin, is a satiety or hunger hormone because the guy who discovered leptin had read this paper. Okay, and this guy, Kennedy, was citing Newberg and also this fellow Brobeck who I quoted. 1960s, you've got the same thing. Here's Jean Mayer in the journal Science again. When for some reason this balance is upset in such a way that energy intake consistently exceeds expenditure, the inevitable result is obesity, the accumulation of excess body fat, once prized in certain societies but now recognized as a major public health problem. So the idea is, again, we've evolved now to accumulate body fat. And then Stanley Schachter, a psychologist, has a theory that people who suffer from obesity don't pay enough attention to external cues. So they don't notice when they're full. This theory is later disproven by one of the researchers who worked with him, who pushed it forward. But the interesting thing is Stanley Schachter is a psychologist. So by the 1960s, the leading figures in obesity research are psychologists, because obesity is considered a problem of eating too much, which is a psychological defect, not a physiological one. Okay, testing the hypotheses. What's interesting is all these hypotheses could be tested. And you could use animal models. The first animal models of obesity came along in the 1930s. So if obesity is caused by eating too much, and you have an animal that gets obese and eats enormous amount of food, you could assume that it gets obese. This is your Falstaff model, because it eats enormous amounts of food, but maybe it gets obese because you've changed its intermediary metabolism somehow, so it's storing too much fat. If the latter is the case, if you don't let it eat too much, it shouldn't get fat. If you believe that obesity is caused by eating too much, and you have an animal that gets obese, what you should do, they're called pair feeding experiments. So you have a lean animal and an animal that's going to grow obese because of its genetics, for instance, or a surgery you could do on it. You measure how much food the lean animal eats, you feed that amount of food to the obese animal, and if you're right about overeating, the obese animal won't get fat. And if you're wrong, it'll get fat anyway. What's fascinating is in every single animal model ever done, possibly one exception, the animals get obese even when you pair feed them, even when you semi-starve them. So this is the OB mouse, which is the most famous mutant mouse ever discovered. It was found in Maine at the Jackson Laboratories in 1950. It was the OB mouse, which is leptin deficient, which was used to discover leptin. And as these folks said as early as 1955, although the restricted obese mice had less fat, they fed less fat than their unrestricted obese siblings, they still maintained body fat concentrations 2 to 4 times as great as their lean siblings, who received 1.3 to 2.7 times as much food. So you starve these animals, or you give the lean animals much more food, and the obese animals get more obese anyway. This is the Zucker rat, which was discovered. This is the announcement of the Zucker rat, a new mutation in 1961. The Zucker rat also has a leptin receptor defect, so it's the equivalent of what's called the DB mouse. And Lois Zucker, who did these experiments, pointed out that when they pair fed them, when restricted to a normal food intake, they are still obviously fat in appearance. Therefore, in these two cases, it's indicated there is an abnormality in intermediary fat metabolism. This is my favorite paper, published by Lois Zucker in 1975. So the hereditarily obese rat, fatty it's called, with food intake restricted to approximately normal, laid down excessive fat at the rate of 0.5 gram per day for up to 74 days on the experiment. This is the prospect of finding a lower food intake which would prevent abnormal fattening is slight. In an experiment involving total starvation of young adults, 42 days of fasting cut the body weight in half, but percent fat was still 38%, far above the normal 15 to 20%. So the animals were still 2.5 times as fat, although below the initial level of 45%. So they lost half their body weight, 7% of their fat. And then Dr. Zucker says, obviously large-scale non-fat tissue loss has occurred and the rat is still fat. It's clear that exploration of the region of greatly subnormal food intake involves cruel experimentation. A few trials indicate that the rats are in acute physiological distress to the extent that 2 cases of tail eating took place. They starved these animals to the point that they were eating their own tails, and they were still obese. Total starvation is much less painful to endure. The fatty state certainly must be characterized as an intractable obesity. This is true for every animal model. These are extreme examples. Okay, the animals didn't get fat because they ate too much. They got fat because they were constantly predisposed. They were created. There was genetic mutation that made them enormously obese. Douglas Coleman himself, Coleman Leptin was discovered by a researcher at Rockefeller named Jeff Friedman, and he worked with Douglas Coleman, who was at Jackson Laboratories, and Coleman had done what are called these parabiosis experiments. So Coleman and Friedman together won a lot of the major awards in medicine until Coleman passed away about 5 years ago. And Coleman said, you know, even when maintained on 50% of normal food intake, mutants still become obese. 50%. It's the most definitive observation in the field, and it's completely ignored by the researchers because they knew what caused obesity. The animals eat too much, and leptin is perceived as a satiety or hunger hormone. Jean Mayer, the leading nutritionist in the United States, actually studied these OB mice when he was at Harvard in the 50s, and he said these mice will make fat out of their food under the most unlikely circumstances, even when half-starved. So what it suggests is if you tell an obese person to half-starve themselves and they remain obese, you cannot blame them. You might just have the wrong advice. So if obesity is a sort of excess fat accumulation, our alternative hypothesis, a hormonal regulatory disorder, the question is what regulates fat accumulation? Again, this is how Hilda Brooke put it. This too took new discoveries, okay? You could learn a lot with intermediary metabolism, but what you could not learn is what regulates fat storage, okay? You needed two new discoveries. You had to be able to measure hormone levels in the blood accurately, and until 1960, that couldn't be done until Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Burson published a paper on what they called the radioimmunoassay. And now for the first time ever, you could measure hormones accurately. And you had to be able to measure fatty acids in the circulation. So fat is stored as triglycerides. That's the storage form, but it travels through the circulation also as fatty acids. And if you can't measure that, you can't track fat going back and forth between the cell. So by the 1956, 3 groups published a new assay to measure fatty acids. Yalow and Burson published a radioimmunoassay, and by 1965, they have worked out the metabolism from fat storage, of adiposity, and as Yalow and Burson put it, insulin is the principal regulator of fat metabolism. So we think of it as a hormone that's dysfunctional in diabetes, and that its primary goal is to make blood sugar go, you know, to move blood sugar into cells so it can be burned, but it also moves fat into fat storage, and this is a diagram from a 2010 textbook by Keith Frayne, who's a leading authority on this research, now retired. But you could see the hormonal regulation of fat tissue, and it's insulin, and then insulin inhibits fat mobilization. And then here's the suppression of fat mobilization in the same textbook, and this is all the various ways that insulin inhibits fat mobilization. The main way it does it, this process lipolysis, so fatty acid, fat comes to fat cells as triglycerides, okay? And then there's this enzyme here, lipoprotein lipase, that effectively reaches into the triglycerides and breaks down these triglycerides into 3 fatty acids. I'm getting there. Probably be late. Eric was late. He set the precedent. Okay, I want to explain it. Insulin inhibits lipolysis. That's the key. And as Yalow and Burson said, release of fatty acids from fat cells requires only the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. This is the most potent sentence in 100 years of science and medicine. If you want to get fat out of fat cells, the fat cells are responding to the absence of insulin, the negative signal of insulin deficiency. This is how Yalow and Burson put it in 1965. We generally accept that obesity predisposes to diabetes, but does not mild diabetes predispose to obesity. Since insulin is a most lipogenic agent, it is the most lipogenic agent, chronic hyperinsulinism would favor the accumulation of body fat. So maybe it's not that obesity causes type 2 diabetes, as most people believe, including one of our former speakers. It's a type 2, a mild form of type 2 diabetes causes obesity. Key points of fat cell regulation. So here it is. We're going to go through, this is textbook medicine, as I'll show you. When insulin is secreted or chronically elevated fat accumulates in the fat tissue. When insulin levels drop, fat escapes from the fat tissue and the fat depots shrink. This is a negative stimulus of insulin deficiency, and we secrete insulin primarily in response to the carbohydrates in our diet. George Cahill did a lot of this work in the 50s and 1960s at Harvard and co-edited a 600-page textbook on this published by the American Physiological Society in 1965. I called him up and asked him about this, and he phrased it as carbohydrate is driving insulin is driving fat. So that's textbook medicine. If you take out these words as driving insulin, you have the logical equivalent, which is carbohydrate is driving fat. And that's quackery. Okay, that's the Atkins diet, because we know that a calorie is a calorie. That's keto, that carbohydrates are fattening. If you actually care about the science of fat metabolism, that's what it's telling you. Okay, so here's the divergence in the field I told you that came to exist between the science of fat metabolism and the science of obesity. This Principles of Biochemistry, Leninger's, is the most well-respected biochemistry textbook in the US. And if you look up fat metabolism or adipocyte metabolism in the index, you'll read that high blood glucose, which you get from carbohydrate-rich diets, elicits the release of insulin, which speeds the uptake of glucose by tissues and favors the storage of fuels. I'm 5 minutes late. I'm close. There's glycogen and triglycerols. Marcel did a long introduction. While inhibiting fatty acid mobilization in adipose tissues. That's the science of adiposity, of fat metabolism. And then they have a section on obesity in this textbook. And to a first approximation, obesity is a result of taking in more calories in the diet than are expended by the body's fuel-consuming activities. If you believe the latter, you tell people to eat less and exercise. If you believe the former, you've got to somehow solve the carbohydrates drive insulin, drive fat accumulation. So here's the alternative hypothesis. Like any growth defect, obesity is a hormonal regulatory disorder. Okay? Like type 2 diabetes, it's fundamentally a disorder of insulin signaling, hence diabesity, and it's triggered by the carbohydrate content of the diet. Okay, not all carbs, not green leafy vegetables, high glycemic index carbs that stimulate. This begins to explain the obesity epidemic in the US, because this is what we were told right about the time the epidemic started. Bread, cereal, rice, pasta, 6 to 11 servings of foods that were traditionally considered fattening, and sweets, sugar, because it's both high glycemic and the half of sugar is a molecule called fructose, which is metabolized in the liver, and you'll have to read my other book about that. So here's the hypothesis. Refined grains, starches, and sugars cause dysregulation of insulin signaling. The end result is excessive fat accumulation, obesity, and the obesity epidemic. It adheres to the laws of thermodynamics, as everything must. It's an entirely different way of thinking about obesity with profoundly different advice. And so the conventional wisdom, diets that work, all diets that result in weight loss do so on one basis and one basis only. They reduce total calorie intake. That's conventional thinking. And this alternative hypothesis, all diets that result in weight loss do so on one basis and one basis only. They reduce circulating insulin, and they do it by restricting carbohydrates. They create the negative signal of insulin deficiency, so the fat cells will release their fat and the lean cells would buy it. And then the question is, should any of this be surprising? And the bizarre thing about doing this, so everyone who's talked has said this is a 300-year-old way of thinking about it. This is an 1869 textbook. Farinaceous means grains and starches and vegetable foods are fattening, and saccharine matters are especially so. This is a line I quoted from the British Journal of Nutrition in 1963, and all my books written by one of the 2 leading British dietitians. Every woman knows that carbohydrates are fattening. This is a piece of common knowledge which few nutritionists would dispute. Then we decided that dietary fat caused heart disease, and we transformed the dietary carbohydrate from something that was inherently fattening, and we had now, by 1963, we're just learning about why it was fattening, and then we transformed it into a heart-healthy diet food. So when you go looking for diets for obesity in the textbooks in the 1940s and 50s, it's interesting. I found 5 of them from major medical schools: Harvard, Stanford, Cornell, Rush Medical School in Chicago, and then this one from Raymond Green's Practice of Endocrinology. Raymond Green was the leading British endocrinologist. He's the brother of Graham Greene, the novelist. And it was pretty simple. It's not that different from what Eric showed you. Foods to be avoided: bread and everything else made with flour, cereals, potatoes and all the white root vegetables, foods containing much sugar, all sweets, and you could eat as much as you want: meat, fish, birds, all green vegetables, eggs dried or fresh, except for the cheese and some of the fruit. This is Eric Westman's diet. It's the Atkins diet. It's keto. And what's interesting is they don't have a percentage, a number of grams of anything you should eat, or a percentage of carbohydrates versus fat or anything else. The idea is these foods are fattening. To those of us who fatten easily, these foods make us store calories as fat. If we don't want to be fat, we cannot eat them. So we avoid them. These foods are not fattening. We can eat as much as we want. It's not about calories. It's about the carbohydrate content. There's a little difference, by the way, in how Eric and I think about this, because, for instance, when Eric talks about nuts, he thinks of them as high-calorie foods. When I talk about nuts, I think of them as a high-carbohydrate food once you've removed all the other carbohydrates from the diet. The catch, and this will be my last slide: why keto? Keto's extreme, right? Why would anyone do an extreme diet? So one of the things that was measured over the years, and once again you needed a new technology. You had to be able to measure insulin levels over long periods of time. The technology was invented by Jerry Reven at Stanford and Ralph DeFranzo, who was at Yale at the time and went to UT Southwestern. And once they did, they could measure how free fatty acids, how fat turnover occurred. So that's the mobilization of fat from fat cells and the burning of that fat from fuel over the course of different levels of insulin. So up here is the high levels of insulin. This would be, the highest level it might reach, and if you were, uncontrolled type 2 diabetic and insulin resistant. And then insulin levels go down in this direction. And you could see that from very high levels to very low levels, there's very little change in fat mobilization and fatty acid oxidation. The phrase used to me by metabolism researchers when I interviewed them, who were alive back then and did this work, and you see this phrase in the articles: fat tissue is exquisitely sensitive to insulin. This is what Yalow and Burson meant when they said the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. If there's any insulin in the circulation, fat cells will hold on to fat. And then you get to a certain point, very low levels, at low physiological plasma insulin concentrations, where the fat cells release the fat, the insulin stops inhibiting lipolysis, and the lean cells take it up and burn it. And the problem is, you don't know where that point is on any individual. Okay? So Eric Westman, for instance, you see very heavy people in your labs. You can bet that this point is higher for them than it is for lean people. And so if you want to get down here, if you want them to see the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency, you got to get them on an extreme keto. Down there, they're in ketosis by definition, because insulin is so low and carbs are so low. For other people, that level is going to be low and they could probably lose fat pretty easily, and maybe they just have to stop eating pasta 3 nights a week. Okay? But this is the logic behind the ketogenic diet. If you want to make sure that you're down there, mobilizing more fat than you expend, you're in ketosis. Okay, just to finish up, Atkins writes his book.
Last slide.
Atkins writes his book, it's the biggest bestseller in history. A couple of his old colleagues from medical school write a critique for the American Medical Association, a critique of low-carbohydrate ketogenic weight reduction diets. They say fat is mobilized when insulin secretion diminishes. They acknowledge everything that Atkins is saying, and then they say, yet low-carbohydrate diets are bizarre concepts of nutrition that should not be promoted to the public as if they were established scientific principles. And for the next 20 years, because they want to argue that we should all eat low-fat diets to avoid heart disease, And they know that people get fat because they eat too much. This entire science of fat metabolism that says you have to restrict carbs, and for many people you have to restrict them to the point that you're in ketosis, gets thrown out with the bathwater. Thank you very much.